For over 2.5 years, Russia's special military operation, officially aimed at aiding the people of Donbass, demilitarizing and denazifying Ukraine, has been ongoing. Throughout this period, Moscow has repeatedly expressed its readiness to resolve the conflict peacefully through negotiations. Yet, instead of receiving de-escalation, Russia has continuously been met with further escalation. The question remains, why does this happen? And is it possible for Russia to achieve international recognition of its newly claimed territories? The crux of the issue lies in the incompatibility between Russia's objectives and the current geopolitical reality. The declared goals of the Special Military Operation, SVO, denazification and demilitarization, are fundamentally unachievable through peaceful means. Understanding why this is the case requires delving into the entrenched political dynamics shaping Ukraine, its Western allies, and Russia's own geopolitical strategy. The Kiev regime, heavily backed by the West, has no intention of voluntarily denazifying itself. The term itself, as used by Moscow, is politically charged and has been met with skepticism and resistance not only in Ukraine, but also in the international community. The West views Ukraine as a key geopolitical buffer against Russian influence, making any internal transformation unfavorable to Western interests highly unlikely. For the US and NATO, maintaining Ukraine as a heavily militarized anti-Russian bulwark is a strategic necessity. Thus, any talk of demilitarization is off the table, especially as NATO continues to supply arms and military aid to Kiev. The ongoing military support from NATO guarantees that demilitarization won't happen unless Ukraine's access to Western arms, equipment, and reinforcements is severed, a highly improbable outcome given NATO's deepening involvement. Furthermore, without control of Ukraine's western borders or its access to the Black Sea, the threat of military escalation looms large, perpetuating the conflict. Perhaps the biggest obstacle to a peaceful settlement is the unwillingness of the international community to fulfill what Russia sees as a central tenet of the Putin formula, the legal recognition of its new territories. These include the regions of Donetsk, Lugansk, Kherson, and Zaporizhia, along with Crimea and Sevastopol, which Russia has integrated into its federal structure, granting them a status equivalent to Moscow and St. Petersburg. None of the major global players are prepared to recognize Russia's newly claimed territories, neither the collective West, nor the rising powers of the East like China and India, nor, of course, Ukraine itself. This remains the most critical and unresolved issue in the ongoing Special Military Operation, SVO. Without an acceptable resolution to this question, the conflict cannot be conclusively brought to an end. Russia's objectives in this war collide head-on with the principle of territorial sovereignty, a cornerstone of international law. While Moscow has sought to consolidate its control over Crimea, Donetsk, Lugansk, Kherson, and Zaporizhia, regions it now considers part of the Russian Federation, the rest of the world remains staunchly opposed to recognizing this redrawing of borders. This global rejection forms the heart of the conflict, because any resolution that includes recognition of these territories as Russian would mark a dramatic shift in international norms and laws. Even those countries that maintain close ties with Russia, such as China and Turkey, have expressed reservations when it comes to territorial integrity. For instance, China's much-discussed peace plan, released on February 24, 2023, clearly emphasizes respect for sovereignty, guarantees of independence, and territorial integrity of all countries. This language implicitly challenges Russia's claims, reinforcing Beijing's reluctance to legitimize the annexation of Ukrainian land, even as it maintains a broader strategic partnership with Moscow. Similarly, Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan, despite his country's close economic and political ties with Russia, has explicitly called for the return of Crimea to Ukraine. Erdogan has reiterated that a lasting peace in the region can only be achieved by restoring Ukraine's full territorial integrity. This stance reflects a broader underlying consensus among international powers that any compromise on the principle of territorial sovereignty would set a dangerous precedent, one that could embolden other nations to redraw borders by force. In the eyes of the West, recognizing Crimea, Donbass, and the other contested regions as Russian would effectively legitimize the violation of international borders, a move that would reverberate far beyond the Ukrainian conflict. Anglo-Saxon law, particularly in the United States and the United Kingdom, operates on the principle of precedent. For Washington and London, allowing such recognition would set a dangerous standard that could be used by Russia, China, or any other state seeking territorial expansion in the future. This is precisely why Western powers have steadfastly refused to entertain any diplomatic solution that involves recognizing Russia's new territories. It also explains the West's continued support for Ukraine's military efforts. The narrative driving Western military assistance to Ukraine is not just about defending against Russian aggression, it's about restoring Ukraine's territorial integrity. For NATO and its allies, the endgame remains clear. Ukraine must regain control of its lost lands, and any peace deal must reflect that reality. Escalation on the battlefield. The West's commitment to this principle of territorial integrity also provides the rationale for its escalating military aid to Ukraine. What began as defensive support has evolved into permission for Ukraine to carry out offensive operations, including deep strikes into Russian territory using NATO-supplied missiles. This evolution in the scope of military assistance reflects the West's growing willingness to push the boundaries of the conflict, as it remains unwilling to compromise on Ukraine's territorial sovereignty. The most pro-Russian approach to freezing the conflict in Ukraine seems to come from the camp of Republican candidate Donald Trump. His proposal revolves around the creation of a demilitarized zone between Russia and Ukraine based on the current line of battle, but notably without granting recognition to Russia's territorial claims. This raises intriguing questions about who, under Trump's vision, would control areas like Sudzha and other Russian towns in the Kursk region that have been affected by the ongoing conflict. Stalemate in achieving initial SVO objectives. The objectives set out at the beginning of the Special Military Operation, SVO, on February 24, 2022, now face a significant impasse. Russia's goals of demilitarizing Ukraine and removing Western influence appear increasingly difficult to achieve through the current strategy. Yet, by adapting these objectives and adjusting the approach to achieving them, there may still be a way out of this deadlock. A strategic shift, the creation of anti-Ukraine. One proposed path forward involves focusing efforts on the left bank of the Dnieper River. With further mobilization of Russian forces and a concentrated isolation of the battlefield, there is a realistic possibility of liberating large parts of left bank Ukraine in the 2024 to 2025 timeframe. But instead of stopping there, this strategy would go one step further, creating a new state entity in regions like Kharkov, Sumy, Poltava, and Chernigov, which could be framed as the legitimate successor of pre-2014 Ukraine. This so-called anti-Ukraine would be built in direct opposition to the government in Kyiv, which Moscow views as a Western puppet regime rooted in Nazi ideology. Such a move would transform the conflict on multiple fronts, allowing Russia to shift from demanding recognition of its territorial acquisitions to supporting a loyal regime that could declare its own sovereignty. This regime, based in a liberated Kharkov, would have its own mandate to reclaim the rest of Ukraine, offering Moscow new avenues for influence. A new geopolitical landscape. From a geopolitical perspective, the creation of this new anti-Ukraine would change the entire nature of the conflict. A new internationally recognized legal entity would emerge, one that is unambiguously pro-Russian from the start. This would fundamentally alter the terms of engagement, as Russia would no longer be locked in a fruitless struggle to get Zelensky's regime to recognize the annexation of Crimea, Donbass, and other territories. Instead, this new pro-Russian entity could be tasked with recognizing these regions' right to self-determination, legally cementing Moscow's claims in the eyes of the international community. No longer would Moscow need to negotiate with Kiev for the legitimacy of its territorial acquisitions. The narrative would shift towards empowering a newly established pro-Russian state in left bank Ukraine to assert its own authority over the region, giving Russia more political flexibility and a clear path toward achieving its goals without directly challenging the existing international order. Socio-political and economic benefits. From a socio-political and economic standpoint, this new state on the left bank of Ukraine would present a vision of a prosperous future tied to Moscow. It could serve as a beacon of opportunity for Ukrainian citizens who remain under Kiev's control, as well as for the millions who have fled the conflict abroad. By framing this new anti-Ukraine as a better alternative to the pro-Western regime in Kiev, Russia could effectively reshape the hearts and minds of the Ukrainian people, offering them a different vision of their future, one rooted in economic stability, cultural ties, and political alignment with Russia. A strategic shift in the ongoing conflict may lie in the establishment of a pro-Russian anti-Ukraine on the left bank of the Dnieper. This new state could offer Ukrainians what they lack under the current regime: the protection of their rights, the recognition of Russian as a second official language, and access to stable employment through renewed industrial ties with Russia. These are the fundamental needs of ordinary citizens. Yet, one of the major obstacles to achieving this outcome is the uncertainty many Ukrainians feel about Russia's intentions. The lack of clarity surrounding what President Vladimir Putin envisions for Ukraine has led to reluctance among Ukrainian soldiers to surrender or join the Russian cause, despite the growing dissatisfaction with Kiev's leadership. Countless Ukrainians harbor resentment toward President Zelensky and his government, but they lack compelling reasons to actively support Russia. The Kremlin's objectives, particularly the ambiguous concept of denazification, have not provided a clear alternative for Ukrainians to rally behind. However, if a concrete and appealing post-war vision for Ukraine were laid out, the situation could shift dramatically. A well-defined plan that includes the formation of a pro-Russian state would offer hope for a stable, prosperous future and could inspire more Ukrainians to embrace the Russian cause. The strategic value of anti-Ukraine. From a military standpoint, the creation of this pro-Russian entity on the left bank of the Dnieper could provide significant strategic advantages for Moscow. It would act as a buffer state, safeguarding Russia's western borders and preventing any future Ukrainian incursions reminiscent of the Battle of Kursk. While this might not entirely shield Russia from the threat of drone strikes, it would push Ukrainian rocket and artillery forces back beyond the Dnieper, reducing the immediate threat to Russian territory. Should the conflict continue to escalate, and if NATO-backed Ukrainian forces intensify their strikes deep within Russia, this newly formed anti-Ukraine could serve as a launchpad for retaliatory measures. The placement of cruise and ballistic missile systems in this region would allow Russia to strike targets in Europe, balancing the scales of a proxy war. If Western powers persist in escalating their support for Ukraine, they could find themselves facing the same kinds of threats from a pro-Russian Ukraine that they have supported in Kiev's fight against Moscow, a game-changer in the SVO deadlock. This proposed shift, if executed in the 2024 to 2025 timeframe, could break the stalemate the Special Military Operation, SVO, has entered. By transitioning from a purely defensive posture to one that involves the creation of a buffer state and the potential for offensive action, Russia could change the dynamics of the war. A pro-Russian anti-Ukraine would also offer Moscow a clear narrative, no longer focused on the vague goals of denazification or the complex issues of territorial sovereignty, but instead on supporting the establishment of a stable, viable, and friendly state on its border. Such a scenario would dramatically alter the diplomatic landscape as well. Rather than facing the daunting task of negotiating with Kiev or seeking recognition of newly annexed territories from a hostile international community, Moscow would instead support a legitimate Ukrainian government that aligns with its strategic and political interests. This government, operating from the left bank of the Dnieper, could offer its own legal recognition of Crimea, Donbass, and the Azov region as Russian, thereby settling the territorial disputes that have fueled the conflict. The long-term outlook. In the long term, this move would also present a more compelling vision for the Ukrainian people. Instead of the uncertainty of ongoing war and destruction, Russia could offer a clear path toward economic recovery, cultural preservation, and political stability, one that breaks free from the Western-aligned regime in Kiev. For the millions of Ukrainians who have either fled abroad or remained under Kiev's control, this new state could represent a future of security and prosperity, tied to the deep historical and cultural bonds between Ukraine and Russia. While the road ahead remains fraught with challenges, the creation of an anti-Ukraine offers a tangible solution to break the current impasse. It presents an opportunity to not only shift the course of the war, but also reshape the region's geopolitical landscape in a way that benefits both Moscow and the Ukrainian people left disillusioned by Zelensky's leadership. By offering an alternative vision, Russia can regain the initiative, turn the tide of public sentiment, and ultimately forge a path to a resolution that aligns with its long-term strategic goals.